Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Great Shot Kid, the show on the Nerd Party Network that examines the work of Star Wars creators both within and without the Star Wars galaxy. I am one of your hosts, John.
And I'm Mike.
And we are here today to bring you an examination of George Lucas's second film, American Graffiti. We've spoken about THX 1138. And American Graffiti, though, is the one that brought great fame to Lucas. You know, well, maybe not great, but enough fame to him that when 20th Century Fox was promoting Star Wars, they said from the director of American Graffiti. So it was expected that you would know who that was.
I mean, he was nominated for Best Director, and the movie was nominated for Best Picture. I mean, it was a huge hit, you know?
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, it's just that I think that Graffiti has been overshadowed through time by his accomplishment with Star Wars. People,
for sure.
I know that speaking as a Star Wars fan, I was completely unaware of the existence of American Graffiti until I was old enough to start reading about he did things before Star Wars. Well, that's so interesting, and watching it. So
I think we all had that moment in high school where we, decided to go back and look at Lucas's other movies, and we pulled out THX 1138 and American Graffiti, and we're like, oh, these are pretty good,
Yes, one of the viewing experiences was better than the other. Especially back then. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm in agreement there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So American Graffiti. Mike, do you want to give a synopsis in case somebody has not seen it?
Sure. Basically, it's the last day of summer for a group of friends that have just graduated from high school, and they're all about to go their separate ways, whether it's off to college or whatever. And this is their last night, not necessarily together because they all kind of are doing their own thing, but it follows this group of friends and sort of like what they do on this night, which is sort of like at where they're all at like a crossroads of their lives, and they're a bunch of kids who just like cruising. They hang out with their cars and they drive around the San Francisco Bay Area, and going to the diner or whatever, trying to get liquor and stuff like that. And they each kind of have their own little journeys and epiphanies along the way.
Yeah, and I think that especially of note with this is I don't think that this is crazy to say, but of course Walter Murch worked on this, so I think he naturally has a lot to do with the sound design, and the way that is used and the way that it informs the emotions of what you're watching. But this is, in a large sense, if you haven't seen it, if you enjoy the works, the first thing I was struck by when I saw Quentin Tarantino was how you see an echo of what Lucas and Murch do in this, which is using music to a very evocative end. And on top of that, with this, it serves a very important purpose of rooting this evening in time. There's no question about where you are in time with this, and this is all very much a big callback to Lucas's own upbringing, when he was growing up in Modesto. So it's in a sense, his own examination of, and I believe he's on record as saying, a way of life that he saw coming to an end, with the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s.
Yeah, and, I mean, you talk about the Tarantino thing, to kind of like take it a step further, it's very similar to what Tarantino does in Reservoir Dogs, where in addition to it being, certain musical choices which evoke certain themes and stuff like that, it's also placed in the context of these characters listening to a radio station,
Right.
And in this movie in particular, it definitely plays into the idea that even though the characters are separated, they're having this sort of communal experience because they're all listening to the same music. The entire town is just sort of like overrun with this music,
Right.
from various sources and everything. And I mean, the music design, which I think in the music editing, which plays a large role in the editing of the movie, I think is very impressive, because Murch creates almost like sort of a Phil Spector wall of sound quality, where
Yes.
like it's nonstop and it's just always there in the background, and it really helps to sort of bridge everything together.
Yeah.
It's really, really impressive,
Yeah, I completely agree about that. And the thing is, speaking of the music, there is it's a lot of fun because we live in an era where we're podcasting and where traditional radio has fallen apart, for by and large. I mean, when I was growing up, when you were growing up, DJs were a thing. Howard Stern was a national name, and so what happens with Wolfman Jack in this is the small scale sort of thing. Each area, each region had their Wolfman Jack, had their guy. And I think that this is, to speak to what you're saying about the radio is, this would be the type of movie where if I ever wanted to explain to my kids what a connective tissue there was about music and the way it was broadcast before everything became, discombobulated, shattered the way that it is with the internet and with streaming and everything like that, this would be the movie I would show, where I would, there's this mystique around this mysterious character of Wolfman Jack. He's this legendary, they even have these theories about where he's broadcasting from and what he's really like. And so to speak to your point, there's this entire mythos about everybody being aware that they're listening to the same thing, and it becomes a point of conversation for them. It becomes something for them to speculate about. It's almost like a conversation about God in a sense, because it's this voice they're all hearing, and they all have different theories of who this voice is, what he's saying to them, and what it means.
Yeah, there's a really interesting psychological component to the idea of listening to music live on the radio or watching, a television program live or something like that. I don't know what it is. Like you can almost feel it. Like even if it's just like a television show where it's like I can watch this, as it's airing. Like I think back to like, let's say like a Twilight Zone marathon on New Year's Day, where you could be like, oh, I'm gonna, watch this, as I can't wait to see what's next and everything. And there's like commercials and everything, and a lot of like, noise. And even if you're sitting by yourself, you compare that to, let's just say, I've got all these episodes on Blu-ray, and I'm just going to watch the same episodes at the same exact time, but I'm going to watch them on my Blu-rays as opposed to on the Sci-Fi Channel, and it feels different because when you're watching them on TV or when you're listening to this music on the radio instead of off of your iPod or whatever, you feel like you're sharing an experience with others, and for some reason it doesn't feel as isolated or lonely in a sense. And
right,
that's something which is pretty much gone,
Yeah, and it's odd. It's sort of like the conversation that I've had, with a friend of mine a couple of years ago, where I, even the way albums are constructed now, we came up in an era that was still informed by the concept album, but or even if you remove it from the concept album, the whole idea was that each album was the sound of where the band was at that specific moment in time, as opposed to a conglomeration of singles. So like, because the mindset wasn't around the idea of selling things at 99 cents at a time. Was you bought the album and listened to it. But aside from that sort of recollection to it, with American Graffiti, something I always like to ask is there one scene in this that pops out at you? Like, when somebody mentions American Graffiti, is there one scene that comes to you? Because I think there are a lot of moments through this that you can hang on to, that you can say, oh, that's the one that says the most to me, or something like that. Is there a scene like that in American Graffiti for you?
I don't know. I mean, I guess the thing that I always kind of think of is really like the first scene where they all kind of like meet up at the diner. And I mean, like a lot of the stuff with the diner, I think is really cool. And I think maybe part of it is just like the way that the diner looks. Like it looks like a place that I want to hang out. And that seems like sort of like the hub of all this activity. And, that's kind of like where I would want to be because that's where you can find your friends. And I think maybe that more than anything else is what sort of like sticks with me. I mean, I know that it's a coming of age story and there's a lot of different aspects to that, and people can relate to different characters more than others. And I mean, I guess if I was to relate to a specific character, thinking about myself at that particular time or whatever, it would probably be like Richard Dreyfuss. But
Yeah.
but that's not really what I think of, or what I mean. Honestly, I think there are other coming of age stories which I relate to much more than American Graffiti. But that idea of the diner
Hmm.
being like the hangout essentially,
Yeah.
that's I think what I respond to more than anything.
See that's so interesting too, because the different coming of age stories that happen through this. I think that is something that because we're talking about this through the lens of the editing, and it really was very. And I remember reading some interview with Lucas somewhere along the way where Universal was very resistant to the idea of these 4 parallel tracks going. And when you think about it, especially with the time period, yeah, these are linear stories that all tie together. But the simple fact that an editor had to sit down with this and make sense in such a way that the audience knew everything that was happening with all of the characters, didn't. And when you jumped back to, Toad's story or something like that, you didn't lose track of who was where and what was going on. Like you're juggling, 4 distinct plot lines basically with this that all intertwine in different ways and come together at the beginning and the end. But this is a movie that very much, they're there at the beginning and they essentially split up and then come back together at the end for one last moment. And but at the same time, it feels like one continuous story. It feels like one tale that's being told, not 4 different stories.
Yeah, in a way, I think like these days that's almost sort of become normalized through like various, sort of like outside the box movies, but also just through like television. There's a lot of like continuing storylines in various shows, which you know you see. But I mean, back then, I think it was probably a lot less common, and I think it's one of the things which really makes this movie stand out. I mean, you take any one of those individual stories, and you just play it out, as is, as like one piece, and it's pretty straightforward. But you put them all together, and it feels more like a collection of moments than it does like an actual traditional narrative. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the movie works so well, is because it's more of an experiential film than like a watching like a story play out. It almost feels just like a collection of moments, and sort of like really does a good job of placing you in that time and place and everything. And the direction, I think, really plays into that too. Like, I mean, you hear Lucas talk, and he talks about this in regards to the editing, but he also talks about it in regards to the direction, and like the idea of like being interested in sort of making pseudo documentaries, and the
Right.
idea of like these moments are happening and I'm just capturing them on film. And you look at something like, and he references this in terms of like Star Wars, and you look at something like Star Wars and you're like, okay. And then like he talks about it in regards to episode 1, and he's like, see, like, look, in this shot all you can see is Jar Jar's elbow. Like, that's a CGI character, but all we did was animate his elbow because, you know, he's just kind of half in the frame because that's just where he happened to be standing, and this, you know, when we had the camera there. And it's like, that's a little, I don't really think that I mean, this is, it's not like we're talking about, you know, Breathless here or something like that, you know what I mean? This is not super outside the box thinking. But I think if you look at American Graffiti, he was doing that, you know? I think
Yeah.
that the way that it was shot and everything, the way that he kind of like lets the actors just sort of like do their thing, and there's a lot of, not necessarily improv, but a lot of sort of like room to breathe, and people not
Oh, yeah.
necessarily always hitting their marks and everything, and the
Oh, sure.
photography, which was, you know, great, and very sort of like gritty while also like epic at the same time. I mean, they've talked about this. Same thing with THX 1138, but it was shot on a format called Techniscope, which was basically like Super 35 before Super 35, whereas essentially just like a flat image letterboxed. But because of that, you're only using like half the frame, and you're blowing it up, and by doing that, it gives it this grainy quality, which makes it look almost like it's 16 millimeter, you know?
Yeah.
And that I mean, you know, that really sort of like, you know, goes into the retro, you know, thing and all that stuff. But the editing, I think, also really plays into that whole aesthetic, because it's like they're finding moments, you know? It's not like you're, you know, going from shot A to shot B to shot C. You're finding the moments, and you have, you know, all of these storylines, and you're figuring out how to place them all together, you know? Which part of the story are you going to tell next? Which part of the story, you know, leads into this? And it's, I can see why. I mean, in a lot of ways, I would almost say this is like the quintessential George Lucas movie, because all of his theories and everything like that, I think, are pushed to the max. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I think like if Star Wars was not the huge hit that it was, he'd probably be making a lot more movies like American Graffiti.
I completely agree with you. I do. I completely agree with you, because I think that this is a movie that finds that balance between the very experimental, abstract sort of storytelling that he was, you know, embracing with THX 1138 and the more mainstream narrative. I think American Graffiti straddles that, finds that sweet spot that he'd always been looking for. And I agree with you that if Star Wars had not been the monster success that it was, I think it's even possible, especially reading Splinter of the Mind's Eye, that we get a Star Wars, if he had to stay low budget, we get a Star Wars sequel that is more like this, more like American Graffiti, than it is about, you know, making the scale bigger and telling a bigger linear story and those sorts of things. And the thing is, I actually, and you know, okay, look, we all know I love the prequels, and we keep coming back to this point, but I think very much that you see this come back. I think that Phantom Menace is a movie that's informed by, you know, the carry through from the reception of Star Wars. And I really think that he moves back with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And I'm not arguing how successful they were, because, you know, I think, you know, they were, but whatever. I think you see him move back toward this with Attack of the Clones, especially of the idea of juggling the different storylines, you know, and going through. And, you know, and I think with Revenge of the Sith as well, like there's one main narrative, but there's very much parallel storytelling going on. I think that you see him, you know, come back more comfortably to American Graffiti style storytelling with the other two prequels. And I think that finds a filmmaker in a very difficult position, because I think he is working back toward this spot here, this comfort zone that he had, and it winds up getting roundly rejected by a lot of people because they want the stuff that informed what he later became. You know, like he's an artist that is literally trapped. You know, he is Darth Vader. He's an artist literally trapped by his own success. he can't experiment anymore.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I had never really thought of that, but just in hearing that, it is actually very similar to Empire. And I mean, not 4 storylines, but 2 storylines, and they start
Right.
off together, and then they branch off and come back together at the end.
Yep.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although Attack of the Clones, it's the same deal because they do come back together at the end in that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely interesting. I was thinking about this while watching American Graffiti. I was doing like a weird 5-step removed what if kind of scenario, but like if George Lucas was an up and coming filmmaker today, okay? And Star Wars was already a thing, okay? Star Wars was created by another guy named George Lucas, right? Who just happened to come into existence or whatever and sold the movie to Disney and everything like that. But there was a younger guy named George Lucas, and he makes THX 1138. And, it's weird and crazy, but beloved by very few people who saw it. And then he makes American Graffiti, and it gets nominated for Best Picture, and he gets nominated for Best Director. That young George Lucas, I guarantee you, I mean, he seems like the exact type of filmmaker that Disney would go after to get to make a Star Wars movie.
I can see. No, I can see your thinking. That makes complete sense to me.
You look at Ryan Johnson, for example. He's got the weird sci-fi movie with Looper, and then he makes let's say Breaking Bad and all these things which people love. Gareth Edwards, the low budget monster, and then he's got like a bigger success, a more mainstream thing. Even Colin Trevorrow with Safety Not Guaranteed. I mean, it's just, I don't know, there's some weird parallels there, and I get the impression that if George Lucas was coming up today, Disney would be like, you want to make a Star Wars movie? I don't know, it's weird.
See, I'm just thinking they wind up giving him the Han Solo one like that.
Yeah.
Because I mean please, when they announced Miller and Lord, it was like, wait, okay, that's awesome, but what? That I'm totally plugging into your thinking is what I'm saying. That's total.
Yeah.
But here's the question, because Lucas has always said he's more comfortable editing a movie, but American Graffiti is not, it's not just George Lucas. He wasn't director, editor, writer, director, editor. He had different people writing the script, and he had Marcia in the editing booth.
Along with Verna Fields, the editor of Jaws.
And there again, no, but there again, because we'll be talking about Paul Hirsch next week, but there again is Lucas is in that circle of friends where I need an editor. Oh, I got somebody. I can help you out with that. Because Hirsch is basically on loan. Hirsch is basically on loan in Star Wars from De Palma. Chew is basically on loan from Coppola, and Marcia Lucas is the North Star, his North Star with these sorts of things. But then, of course, there's Murch also, in the mix here. He doesn't carry over to Star Wars, but Murch is very much in the mix, informing, I think, unquestionably how Lucas approaches sound. I think Lucas is a different director and has a different editorial philosophy if he is not with Murch on THX 1138 and then American Graffiti. I think that Murch's involvement here has a very heavy influence, and I think that the editing here of how to juggle between all of these different storylines, I think that winds up becoming, because everybody you work with influences something that you've done or something that you will do. You pick up things from people that you work with. And so, I mean, my question is, what about Marcia Lucas's contribution? Is there any echo we can see in Star Wars? Is there anything from here where we could say, okay, there's a signature, or is it just that she was a sanity check? Like, every good editor should be a sanity check on the director and be able to say to them, I know you want that, but it's going to play better this way. Should be able to stand up to them, basically. Do you think that carries through to the that informs the success of American Graffiti artistically.
I mean, it's so hard to say, like what is it exactly that, especially when you have a movie like this where there's two editors and it's like what exactly did Marcia Lucas do or whatever. But I do think that, if you look at their work together and the movies that they worked on and the fact that he even brought her back to work on Jedi and stuff like that, I think that, what you see there is someone who Lucas trusts and who seems to be on the same wavelength with Lucas. You know what I mean? The fact that he used her again and again and again suggests to me that like whatever it is that she was doing was what Lucas was looking for. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because certainly there are people who are not a good fit at times. I mean, they've talked about like Aliens, for example. Ray Lovejoy, was hired to edit Aliens, and the reason why James Cameron the reason why James Cameron hired him was because he edited 2001, and he's like, well, I want that guy, and then the two of them get together, and it's just they do not understand what the other one is talking about, and it ends up being like a really bad relationship, and the two never work together again. But you look at like Marcia Lucas, and they're always working together, all the way up through Jedi, and
which she's working on, even though they're going through a separation and divorce during post production in that. So you can only imagine how. I mean, there are stories as you continue your journey reading the making of books by Rinsler.
Yeah,
he makes a special point to talk about how the crew noticed exactly, like Lucas didn't really talk about everything that was like people didn't know what was going on. Only a few people knew at first, and yes, his there were people who embraced the the idea of, oh no, I'm going to do it till it gets it right, and Lucas had already approved a shot and was apparently, he was like, what the hell is this? I already approved this shot. Why is this shot back up in front of me, right?
Yeah.
And they were like, there was a decided difference in his demeanor during Return of the Jedi than there was during, Star Wars and Empire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, just the fact that he would, work with her again and again, like even through that, I mean, that really, I think does, speak to whatever it is, that she was doing, the two of them seem to have to be a really good fit, creatively speaking.
Now speaking of creative, the one question I do want to get at is that Lucas did revisit the mastering and I believe the very opening shot, at the very least, of American Graffiti when it came out on Blu-ray.
Yeah.
The tinkerer could not leave things completely alone.
I'm pretty sure that's the
It's in his
only
nature.
shot which was changed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure too. My question becomes, was there anything strange that you noticed about the Blu-ray restoration that struck you as odd? Was there any color shift that you picked up on or anything like that seemed out of place?
Not that I noticed. I think this was actually done for the DVD before the Blu-ray came
okay.
out.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, like that shot, what they like added, basically, they made it like more of like a sunset kind of thing.
Yes, instead of
Which-
I think the original shot, it was a more monochromatic sky. It was just the shot that they had on location,
Right.
and he put in something with a lot more orangey and cloudy, idyllic sunset sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I see the reasoning behind it. I think I read this when they did it. It was like, well, basically the idea is this is going to be from dusk till dawn, and it's like the sun sets, and then the last scene is when it rises, and it's the night. It's just about that last night, and I mean that makes sense, and it's such a a subtle change that I don't think that anyone could really complain about it. I think one of the things that they did do, which I think works pretty well, is I think they remixed the sound as well into 5.1 instead of mono, similar to what Merch did on Conversation, and I think that actually sounds pretty good, But I did not notice any like color shifts throughout the movie. Is this something which people are complaining about?
No, I mean, I know that you have an eye for it. I didn't see anything particularly. The strange thing is, I remember the first time I watched it after that shot had been tweaked, and I was, it was a little jarring because, whoa, you even touched it. Like if you think about it, everything that he has ever directed, I think possibly Revenge of the Sith escapes this.
Yeah, I don't think Revenge of the Sith. Yeah,
but on subsequent releases, he has tweaked every last one of them.
Oh no, wait, he has tweaked Revenge of the Sith because he put it into 3D.
No. But I'm talking about changes to the shots or editing or sequences. Because when the Blu-ray, I mean, even the Blu-ray of Attack of the Clones, it's jarring what happened with the ending on that. It had a perfectly paced ending, and I'm okay with it now. But he tweaked the ending of Attack of the Clones in the Blu-ray. Phantom Menace, he tweaked on the VHS release, then he tweaked on the DVD release, then he tweaked on the Blu-ray release.
Well, Attack of the Clones was actually tweaked from 35 millimeter to digital was different. And then,
yes, it was.
And then it was tweaked, well, in various ways. It was tweaked for the IMAX version, but...
Yes. Okay. Yeah, but I mean that's very much a technicality. I did see that in the IMAX version.
But the IMAX version is where they first because remember when Padme's lying on the ground and they're like, Padme, are you okay? And she's like, yes, and then gets up. And then on later versions they changed it so that she's like, so she doesn't sound like a robot, Like that the first time that was changed was on the IMAX version.
Although, well, I mean, and they cut out some stuff. They cut out arguably the worst line exchange in the entire. I wish they would actually cut it out.
Yeah,
because that scene the scene in front of the fireplace plays wonderfully, except for one exchange, and every time it comes up, I'm like, oh god, you could just.
Yeah,
it's 3 seconds. Just cut that one thing right there.
Yeah, they had to cut 20 minutes or so out of the movie for and they also changed the aspect ratio. So
and the digital effects. I remember especially when he's talking to the Jawas at the Sandcrawler, the digital effects upscaled terribly.
Yeah, it was not a good release.
Yeah, but basically, the whole thing is that he hasn't left anything alone. Nothing is untouched on disc that he has directed.
Except for Revenge of the Sith, I think. Why? Because that's his thing. He's a tinkerer, He can't... He's always looking at it and always, trying to make it perfect, right?
But does it say something that this, American Graffiti, he tweaks that opening shot, but everything else is left?
Well, but it's not, though, because even going back, originally, and I mean, I guess this is kind of a minor thing. It's his fault or whatever, or that's not really his fault. But the studio,
cut. They were minutes,
yeah, right. And then when after it became a huge success, he's like, I'm sticking those 3 minutes back in.
Yes, that's true.
So I mean, that's it's not like people think of it because of the special editions, because of the discs, but I mean, you go back and almost every version has an alternate theatrical release. Star Wars, Empire, Jedi is actually the same, which is weird, I think. And then, looking at, even the new movies like Attack of the Clones, there were 2 versions of that movie, running around movie theaters. If you saw it in digital, you saw a couple of different shots,
And what's actually, I'm sorry, but to actually, I remember listening to the commentary for that, and Lucas in the arena scene when Jango Fett gets killed, spoilers, he's sitting there and he's saying, oh, well, in the digital release, we added this. Oh, look. Oh, no, this is the version I'm watching. And it's and for me, that sort of moment drove me nuts because I was like, okay, come on, dude. How can you not know what I noticed the difference. How could you not notice that sort of thing? So,
yeah. But, I mean, I think that's just his thing. I mean, I think you could get into the psychology of that, versus, someone, who says once the movie is out, it's out, and I don't want to touch it. I want to leave it exactly as it is because it's a a moment in time, that kind of thing, which is certainly the other philosophy, which I think more filmmakers tend to embrace. It's like you work on the movie until someone rips it out of your hands, but at that point, it's done. It's a done deal.
Well, I mean, I guess you could argue that he approaches it more like a painter, where until you put that painting in a frame behind glass, he's going to keep coming back to it. He considers
but the
it
thing,
a canvas
because I remember there was obviously a lot of talk about this back in '97, when he did this, and I remember reading some think piece on it, and the way that the article started was it was some painter, I forget who, some famous painter from God knows which century, and they did some sort of masterwork, and it was on display at this museum. And he was there as a guest of honor or whatever, and he's looking at the painting, and then he leaves, and then he comes back, and like in the middle of like this, gallery or whatever, he comes back with his paintbrushes, and he starts tweaking his own painting.
Yeah.
And everyone's freaking out like, you're ruining it. And it's like, he's like, well, it's mine though, right? I can do that, right?
Yeah.
And it was sort of like, a philosophical question, like, can you? I mean, like, are you allowed to? At what point does the painting stop becoming yours and start becoming the audience?
See, I'll credit Martin Scorsese with giving a great lens into Lucas for me with The Aviator, because I learned a lot about Howard Hughes in that movie. And the fact that he went back and he kept tweaking and retweaking every time a new technology came out, he kept retweaking his movie that had won an Oscar. He kept retweaking it over and over and over again because a new technology came out. And he said, oh, this is an opportunity to make it even better, to make it better, to make it better. And I mean, to speak to that thing, like I understand in a very personal sense. There was a time where I painted a lot more than I do now, and I would either continually tweak or destroy whatever I created. And so there's a friend of mine who has everything that I ever did up to a certain point, because he insisted. He was like, no, don't destroy. I'm going to preserve. And the only way he could keep me away from it is he actually had them like locked up in a room. He was like, you can't even get to them. You can't even see them. You can't touch them. So, like, I mean, that's the thing is, like, I have I understand why he does that. I understand why he feels the compulsion to do that. But nobody particularly cares that he did that with American Graffiti. Nobody makes a note of it.
Well, I think the reason for that, and it really gets into sort of like the psychology of this and everything. I think there's two reasons. One, as popular as American Graffiti is, it's not nearly as popular as Star Wars. And while certainly there are some people who probably see that opening shot and are like, damn, he messed that up. I know what that shot's supposed to look like, and that's not what it is. There's very, very few people, comparatively speaking, to, Star Wars. I think, Max described the Star Wars thing best, which is like, whether or not it's better or worse, it's like listening to a song that's been remixed or something like that, where that song so well, every single note, that when one note is changed, there's just something in your brain that like glitches, and you're like, that's not right, whether or not objectively it's better. Yeah, it's just, it feels wrong to you personally.
There is a fantastic that's a great example, because I am a huge Doors fan, and when they re-released a box set a couple of years ago, they did the new stereo remasters, and Roadhouse Blues, they amped up the harmonica in the beginning, and they re-emphasize, like, everything gets sort of like re-emphasized and like teased out and everything, and it drove me nuts for the longest time. It even drove me nuts on Break On Through, when they added in, instead of they added in the original lyric, she gets high, she gets high, she gets high. And every time, to this day, when I hear it, because I listened to that album until the record wore out, and I hear she gets high, and I'm like, nuts, no. and they
Yeah.
added back in all of the cursing that they had masked over for the end. And it's like, well, okay, well, I definitely can't listen to this at all in front of anybody now, that sort of thing. So.
It's like that in reverse for the Beatles, where just recently, well, I mean, a few years back, they released that box set of all of their mono mixes,
Okay.
and those are the definitive versions. Like, the Beatles, their philosophy was basically like everyone's going to have mono. That's going to be what people are going to be listening to. So they would put all of their time and effort into creating the mono mixes, and then basically handed them off to what's his name, the fifth Beatle.
Yeah.
George something. George.
Yeah. I always think of Eddie Murphy from Saturday Night Live, so I'm no good on that.
That guy, and he's the one who basically like did the stereo mixes, but then as technology was what it was, the stereo mixes are what everyone's heard, and you go back and for the most part it sounds pretty damn similar, but there are certain songs where there's something which is substantially different and you're just like, whoa, like something on Sergeant Pepper or Revolver, and you're like, this is weird, even though that is what they always intended, and probably what we should have been listening to all along. That's not what we're listening to. Not what we listen to. But I mean, I think the other thing about the difference between the American Graffiti shot and Star Wars, well, two things. One, it literally is just one shot, and two, it's very unobtrusive. Where I think the problem that a lot of people have with Star Wars is that it really does feel anachronistic. It does not feel like a movie which was made in 1977. It feels like a movie which was made in 1997,
right?
Mixed with a movie which was made in 1977. And those two things just don't gel. And that's why people, I think, have a big problem with it, And not to mention, like what you were saying, where it's like, that thing where if he had released the versions, the 1977 versions, people probably wouldn't care one way or another.
Yeah.
But the fact that, you can't get them, it's become a thing. It's like a holy grail thing. But that obviously doesn't apply to American Graffiti because it's the same scenario, but it's just that one shot.
I mean, I'm sure there are people alive who saw it in the theater with the 3 minutes missing, but I've never seen it without those 3 minutes, so yeah. I'm not too terribly concerned about it.
Right.
So, any final thoughts on American Graffiti? Do you recommend? Is this a movie that you would qualify as a must see for a film fan?
I think it's pretty high up there. I mean, I don't know if it's a must-see, but I think if you're a George Lucas fan, you should definitely see it. I think that, if you look at, let's say, his first three movies, THX, American Graffiti, and Star Wars, I would put this at number 2. And I think that it really does show kind of like the evolution of his career. And I think that it's also sort of like a glimpse at, sort of like Lucas in his purest form. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think Star Wars has become such a thing, and Lucas and his, like tastes as an older filmmaker have become such a thing that Star Wars kind of gets lumped into that sort of weird, nebulous, untouchable, category where it's like almost like it's not a movie anymore. It's a Star War. And I think that, you look at like THX, American Graffiti, and Star Wars as this weird trilogy, you can get the idea of what kind of filmmaker George Lucas would have been if he wasn't the guy who created Star Wars. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. No, I am with you, and I definitely think that we should, at some point in the future, revisit my theory that if you watch the prequel trilogy, you can actually see basically a step-by-step, therapy mechanism for a filmmaker who is older, reliving the stages of his early career as you walk through the prequels. I think you see Phantom Menace is THX, Attack of the Clones is Graffiti, and then Revenge of the Sith is Star Wars. And
Oh,
I definitely think that there's something to be said about that. But what I would really like to say something about is that if you want to reach out to the show, if you have thoughts about American Graffiti and you want to share them with us, you can go to thenerdparty.com/contact. Look up the show. Look up any of our shows and go ahead and reach out to us. Let us know what you're thinking, what you think of what we said. You can find us on iTunes. Look us up. Give us a review. We think we've got a pretty nifty show here. Go ahead and let the world know what you think of it. And just look up Great Shot Kid on iTunes, and we'll turn up, and you can drop us a review. We will read your review on the show. We would greatly appreciate it. It helps other people find the show. And, Mike, where can people find you roaming around on the internet?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Mumbles3K, and you can find me on commentarytrackstars.com doing commentary track stars, where we do audio commentaries and various other things. And you can also find me on Trek.fm, where I do a show called Stage 9, where we look at the people who make Star Trek. It's very similar to this show, only Star Trek instead of Star Wars. And one of the things which makes it so similar is the fact that my co-host is John.
Mills, yes, me. I'm on that show too, and that show is actually a great deal of fun. We are actually going to be looking at. We actually just looked at Pacific Rim this week, and we will be joined by Larry Nemechek over on Stage 9 to talk about Jonathan Frakes and his contribution to the Star Trek Masterwork series, such as it is. And you can find me as Kessel Junkie on your social network of choice. You can find me co-hosting Words with Nerds with my pal Craig. And you can find me right here on the Nerd Party co-hosting Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast with Matthew Rushing. And be sure to find us on Twitter, on the show official Twitter handle, @JoinNerdParty. And join us next week when we will be looking at the work of Paul Hirsch, the third editor on the original Star Wars, and his work with Brian De Palma on the film Sisters.